Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is the legendary editor Tina Brown. Her best-selling book is The Diana Chronicles. Thank you for being here.
Delighted to join you, Teresa.
And your title, you're actually Lady Evans.
Only when I can't get a room in a restaurant.
Does it work pretty well?
It does.
Listen, you were just a kid when you took over the editorship of the Tatler, and you increased circulation 300%. Mm-hmm. That is amazing.
Well, you know, it was a tiny little magazine. Let me first say that when I first took it over. So 300% might sound great, but, you know, it was taking it from like 10,000 to, you know, whatever, 300% of that is. I've always loved both activities, writing and editing. But I did begin my life first as a writer. Then I morphed into being an editor, where, of course, I stayed for the next 22 years. And now I have written the Diana Chronicles, which, you know, was wonderful to go back to. And now, in fact, I'm back to editing again, where I've started my new website, The Daily Beast, which has kind of taken off in the last few months.
Well, back at the Tatler, you had to learn some interesting lessons. You mentioned you've been an editor all these years, and you went on to be editor of Vanity Fair and then the New Yorker. What were some of the most important lessons you learned at Tatler that helped you when you went on to these larger and more prestigious venues?
Well, my first lesson, I guess, was that, you know, first, if you don't have a budget, you better have a point of view. But actually, having a point of view, it turns out, which is what you have to develop when you don't have a budget, was really a very good honing skill for everything that came next. Because I still believe that a magazine can't succeed without a point of view, without an attitude, without a sense of what you want to say. And then, of course, it's about assembling the great talents who also have an attitude and a point of view, very much their own. So it's always been about a wonderful kind of talent bazaar, as far as I'm concerned. And an editor's job really is to simply make everything in the storefront window shine.
When you look back to your tenure at Vanity Fair, what do you consider your outstanding contributions?
Well, at Vanity Fair, we took over I took over an ailing magazine at the time. Amazing to say. I mean, when I took over, it was had 15 or 20 pages of advertising, and it was 250,000. And we took it to over a million, and of course the big fat glossy thing that it is today on the coffee table. And we did it really by, again, same philosophy, bringing in the best talent, letting them rip. That's on the photographic side as much as on the writing side. Mm-hmm. Wonderful talents like Annie Leibovitz, you know, and at the time Helmut Newton, who of course died recently, but terrific writers. I had Dominic Dunn, who hadn't actually written any magazine pieces before I found him. He was a movie producer, actually, and I encouraged him to write his first piece for us, and he took off and became, in a way, one of the signature voices of the magazine. So it's really, I mean, I think an editor is only as good as the writers and photographers that you know, they bring into the stable.
Do you have an instinct for talent? Did you just instinctively know that Dominique would be a good writer?
I did, actually. I mean, I do think that one of the things I can and do, and actually which I now find at the Daily Beast, the internet, in fact, is a wonderful mechanism to do, is to liberate new voices, find new voices, so that you could be sitting chatting to somebody and thinking, goodness, what an amazing story this guy has, and how well he's telling it to me. Maybe maybe he could write it, and then following that instinct. And not always, doesn't always work, but very often people can actually write, and they become very good writers. Now, you know, very often I also see something small somewhere, like Malcolm Gladwell, who's become a major best-selling writer. He was writing sort of book reviews and smaller pieces and various sort of more, you know, had not really got a big reputation at all, but we liked the smaller things that he'd done and brought him into the New Yorker. And the first piece he wrote for me actually was a piece he called The Tipping Point, which we discussed, and I thought that was a great idea. And then he went on, of course, to develop it into a book that hasn't just been a bestseller. It's been, you know, really something of a phenomenon. I mean, it remains kind of on years later, it's still on the bestseller list, you know. So Gladwell was a wonderful hire, as it turned out. But it's just about following one's sense of what's a good sentence, really, half the time.
You were the first woman editor-in-chief of the New Yorker.
Correct.
How big a challenge was that?
It was a pretty big challenge because it was very much a boys' club when I came, and it was very kind of entrenched in its ways. You know, I was only the third editor in 70 years, if you can imagine. I mean, it really had been in fourth editors, excuse me, but it's still, you know, a tiny amount of people to be in a huge legacy like that. So a lot of people had really been entrenched and were very suspicious of this young kind of woman coming in who, you know, had edited Vanity Fair, where Demi Moore was on the cover with a pregnant tummy. You know, like what's she doing here in the hallowed halls of the New Yorker and the Literary Gem? But actually, I think people fast began to understand that actually I just love great writing, and I'm always going to support that. And once that trust was kind of won, and you know, we were able to bring in new terrific writers like David Remnick and Malcolm Gladwell and Jane Mayer and all these terrific people who are still there, the people who were there already became aware that the younger Fry was sort of pretty talented themselves. So it gradually shook out and became a very happy shop, I must say.
How hard was it for you to leave the New Yorker and then spearhead Talk magazine?
Very, very hard. I was bitten by the sort of entrepreneur bug. I felt after 7 years at the New Yorker that my next step had to be trying to kind of own my own thing, you know, be an owner, you know, as it were, be a participant in something, which I think is a very sort of American sort of bug in a way. It's like, you know, you feel white, you know, I've had 3 magazines, it's time to get off the salary and be, you know, a participant. But, you know, as it happened, my timing was off, you know, shortly after we launched, 9/11 happened and advertising collapsed. In fact, when I'm looking at this cycle now, I'm thinking, you know, these terrifying cycles that happen and kick in. I mean, at the end of the day, however, the best laid plans can go awry. And, you know, we all of us don't know what's coming down the pike, you know, so your timing can be perfect or it can be bad. Actually, you know, in fact now, oddly enough, although it may seem as if the timing might be bad for a new internet venture, it actually isn't. It's a wonderful time, it turns out, to do the Daily Beast, because unlike a Talk magazine, which did get caught and died, now seems to be the time where this is where the action is, you know, that the energy, in a way, now has moved to the web. And I'm really excited to now have a chance to edit again, but in this new medium, and in a way participate in the great sort of media transition that's happening. I wouldn't really have missed it for the world.
And you mentioned that word transition. Don't you think eventually, and I know this isn't popular to say, that pretty much all of our magazines are going to be digital?
I think a great many are. I think we are. There'll always be some, you know, quality print and I think that, you know, print won't be extinguished by the web any more than TV was extinguished radio. You know, these things do actually shake out and realign. But I think a lot will go online, and I think that it's a painful transition. But having made the transition kind of perforce, because when Talk closed, I had to kind of reinvent myself as an author and then look for other things, you know, to kind of regenerate my own kind of editing side. And as a result, I now feel I'm a participant in something new and very exciting. And in fact, I'm surrounded now. I've got a very young team. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of my early days at the Tatler when I was 25, because now my children are all, you know, have left home. I'm suddenly like a single woman. I mean, my husband and I, we like, you know, we can work late at the office, as it were, you know, and all the things you can't do when you're a working mom. So it's a very exciting time for me.
And you also did a stint on television. I mean, you were host
yes,
of
oh yes, we forgot that detour into TV.
Yeah, that was great.
Well, that was really interesting to do, and actually TV really serves you very well when you're starting a web venture, because some of the values and speed and things you learn on TV are kind of the same to what the online experience is. It teaches you to speed up, to think all the time about what the audience is really after, and making the most of those precious minutes, which is very good, you know, when you're working online.
How tricky a transition was it for you to go from print interviews to television interviews?
I find TV enormously hard. I think that as an interviewer, it's hard.
Very different dynamic.
Very different dynamic. I mean, you know, I love doing it, but I think it's a whole other skill set. And in a way, having my own talk show made me very respectful in the sense of TV talent, who often get kind of somewhat put down sometimes. They're like, oh, well, you know, it's just a TV anchor, whatever. Well, I'm sorry, but when you try to do it yourself, you discover it's very hard, you know, to keep an interview moving in the right time frame with maximum interest, really where everything is working in, you know, in sync. It's a hard skill, and people who do it well are very gifted.
So you pull back a little bit from all of these various endeavors to focus almost exclusively on the Diana Chronicles. A lot has been written about Princess Diana. What more needed to be said? You were her friend.
Well, I felt that, in a strange way, what I learned about journalism very often is that when everything seems to have been said, nothing is known. It's a funny thing where there's so much kind of stuff and information and tabloid and false information, bad books and good books, and it's all just dumped on top of a person's reputation. And what can really be very exciting, I think, as a writer, is to go right back to the roots and start again and look at everything with fresh eyes, which is what I tried to do. And I was very interested in the makings of Diana's childhood and her girlhood and her evolution as a woman in the period in which she lived. I looked at Diana not just as Diana, but as Diana in the context of her school, her home, her aristocratic background, her relationship to the monarchy, her friendships and love affair inside the monarchy, and of course her marriage, all of which was so interwoven with the whole cultural fabric of the country that I felt it was more than just a biography. It was also a chance to have a kind of look at social and media history.
Oh yeah, I think that that's one of the things that makes this book a really standout, and one of the reasons that magazines like the New Yorker say it's the best book that's ever been written about Princess Diana. She's such a mythic figure. You illustrate that beautifully in the book. Were you ever overwhelmed by the scope of this project? I'm thinking of Karen Armstrong when she sat down at her typewriter to write the title of her book, The History of God, when you sat down and wrote the Diana Chronicles.
It was very daunting. The first year, I have to say, was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because I felt exactly that. But I went to London a great deal, to England, and I must have made about 7 or 8 trips, and I spent each time no less than 3 or 4 weeks at a time, just intensely interviewing everybody who'd known Diana, her friends, her families, relationships, her working relationships, the people at the time who made her world. And every interview yielded some wonderful new detail, and you just had to build it up block by block, quote by quote, until I had what I called my, it's like my sort of world encyclopedia of Diana, my huge folder of all these interviews, and every one of them offered some insight which I then had to weave together. That part I really did enjoy, actually, and in the end the writing process became very exciting.
So even though you knew Diana, you found out things about her that surprised you.
Absolutely. I was able to weave it, of course, with my own memories. And actually, I'd had lunch with Diana only 6-7 weeks before she died in New York. She had come to Manhattan for the auction of her dresses at Christie's, and she came through New York and she wanted to have lunch, and we went to the Four Seasons restaurant, and I went with Anna Wintour, the editor of Vogue. The two of us together, we took her out for a sort of a girls' luncheon, and what was haunting to me and what really helped me as well drive the book was how through that lunch, this beautiful woman, and my goodness, when she walks into, into a restaurant, it just, heads just turned. She was much taller than people kind of realized, which made her like a supermodel, and she had this amazingly beautiful skin and these huge eyes, far more beautiful, I have to say, in person than in any of her pictures. It's a real knockout of a girl. And yet her refrain was just so lonely, through the lunch. She kept harking back to the failure of her marriage and how it had left her lonely. And she said, which really haunted me, it was in July, we had the lunch in 1997, and she said, I dread August. She said, I dread it because the kids go to Balmoral to stay with Prince Charles. And she said, I'm left without my kids. And she said, in August, everyone's away with their families. And, I have to kind of find someone to stay with. And she said, nobody really who have sort of good relationships really want all that crazy paparazzi. They don't, having me to stay, she said, is so much baggage. And she said, no man really who's worth much, wants to, meaning, in terms of being a decent guy, really wants all that hassle and craziness in their life. She said, I have a lot of baggage. And she said, it's very difficult for me. And I was very sad for her, because I felt here was this beautiful woman basically saying, I've got too much baggage to get a date. It was incredible irony. You even mentioned in the book that she's alone one evening on New Year's Eve, calling up friends, and here she is, the most famous person in the world, really, and she's by herself. So that's one of the misconceptions that we have about her, that she was always surrounded by beautiful people having a good time. What are some of the other misconceptions we have about who she was? Well, I think that that on the other hand, although Diana was so lonely and I felt had such a desperate amount of heartache, Diana also was a brilliant media operator. I mean, she really was. I mean, she had an instinct for the camera, an instinct for the media that was really almost unparalleled, really, except for the leading movie stars. You know, one of the people I know who used to photograph her a lot said she always knew when the camera was on her, even when her back was turned. She had that sense, a kind of incredible star quality. I also think that what really did surprised me when I really dug into it was just quite how bleak her own family life had been. You know, I think, everybody knows the fairy, almost like a fairy story, that, her mother died and the stepmother, and she came in and her father was remarried to the woman she didn't like, and all these things. We know these things about Diana, but it underestimates quite how bitter her family background really was, because her mother, when she left her father, Earl Spencer, had gone off with another man, and there was then this horrible custody battle over the children. And, Diana's grandmother actually backed Earl Spencer. Diana's own mother was testified against by her mother. So that, that's a pretty harsh thing in a family where your own your daughter, as it were, is the person you're testifying against, in order that the kids can stay with, Earl Spencer, which was widely felt in the circle she did, because she wanted those kids to be raised in the aristocracy rather than leave the home with the mother. That's a pretty bitter beginning to anybody's life.
Oh, of course it is. And you make this wonderful association in the book about the role the camera played in her early family life, and that perhaps she associated that with a kind of intimacy.
Absolutely right. Her father, when her mother left, really was a lonely guy, and rather had a tough time expressing himself, like a lot of English men of that class. And he used to express his affection for his kids by photographing them a great deal, and Diana was his favorite to photograph. And I do feel that in a way Diana came to associate the camera with her father's love, because that was the way he expressed his affection to her.
You made a statement in the book that I just found so fascinating. I've been thinking about it for some time, that when we obsess about people and look at them obsessively, that it actually changes how they look. I wonder if you'd elaborate on that.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I do feel that in a strange way celebrities do seem to change their appearance simply by being looked at. Now, in some ways, of course, it's illusory. It's probably, perhaps the reality is simply that they have, more of an ability to transform themselves and have the most, become, their fullest potential with the aid of beauty and hair and all the rest of the stuff they have. But there is something about being constantly looked at that makes a celebrity literally seem to kind of swell in presence, and some of the biggest movie stars, do have larger heads, and it's one of those things. I feel the same way, in a way, about Hillary. When you look at the pictures of her, she's so transformed by being looked at.
Isn't that an interesting concept? I'm going to think about it some more, but I just found that fascinating, and I'm going to be watching that. It would be impossible to have a discussion about Diana without talking about all the conspiracy theories that surround her death. You refute all the ones, at least that I have heard within your book. Do you have absolutely no doubt that her accident, that it was truly an accident?
Yes, I do think Diana's death was a tragic accident, and I think that the inquest, which only happened, a few months back, absolutely indisputably proved that this was a hideous sort of concentration of awful, bad timing and fate, that everything wound up the way it did that night. However, it is true to say that in the course of my reporting, and indeed of knowing her, I have no doubt that she was spied on, and that there was around her a tremendous amount of palace ill will, internal informing, tapping of her telephone. It definitely happened. And so therefore we were in a situation where she felt so spied on and preyed upon all the time that her paranoia was justified. And yet, at the other side of the coin, because she felt so paranoid and spied upon, she refused to have any more police protection after her divorce. What an irony. Because she didn't trust the police not to spy on her. And yet, if the police protection had been with her the night in Paris, they would never have allowed her to get into that car with that driver. There's no question. No one who drives a Royal, if they have Royal protection, has ever allowed to drive when they've had a drink, and no Royal protection officer would have allowed the way Henri Paul was behaving that night. They would have absolutely not allowed her to get into that car or have that crazy exit plan and go careening off with the police, the paparazzi behind her. This wouldn't have happened. So here the irony is that by being spied on, she ended up actually in the middle of a conspiracy for her own death.
What sort of reaction have you had from the royal family about the book?
Well, I know that many of the intimate circle of the royals liked the book very much. Certainly, there were certain ladies in waiting and members of the court who've expressed that to me. Whether they're expressing the royals' own feelings, I don't know. I think that the royals do tend to only speak to one another about those issues, and very often they just don't read things because there's been so much. But I'm certainly on good terms with many in the close royal circle. So that makes me feel that perhaps the book was well received.
What impact did writing this book have on you personally? Was it hard to let it go?
Was very hard to let it go. I came to really, particularly in the last few months, I really was deeply involved and felt I would like to have had another 3 months to go on exploring the aftermath of her death, and would like in a way to have been able to include in the new afterword I attended the inquest, much of it, and I have a chapter on it. I would have probably liked to do 4 or 5 chapters on it because it threw up so much interesting material and just the characters in her life, crazy characters, that it would have been fun to have written even more about. But at a certain point, somebody said, I think, that a book is never finished, it's simply abandoned. And I think that's true. I think that no writer would really ever finish if there wasn't a deadline.
Well, in the book, you do a close examination of the media and how they treated Diana and how they became exploitive and obsessive. Has writing the book changed the way you view yourself as a journalist at all?
Well, I think that it certainly has made me see what a terrifyingly invasive and predatory role the media can play if given half a chance. And the lesson of Diana really was, as any kind of public figure, and as you get more written about and talked about, inevitably, you feel there are lessons to be learned from super famous people like her. And one of her mistakes actually was that she did believe that you could sort of let the media into your life and then close them off when you didn't want them. And you can't really do that. I mean, the truth is that if you make the mistake of giving too much of your life away to the media, it's very hard to dial it back. So when, for instance, public figures and movie stars on the way up, sort of will do anything to get attention, then they don't like the attention. And you can't dial it back. So it's really about, be careful about that Pandora's box when you open it, because it might have consequences you can't control.
If you could ask Diana one more question, what would it be? That's a hard one.
Yeah, I think that will be, why did you go with David Ely on that last vacation? Because the woman that I met in New York was so, despite being lonely, she was so directed in her philanthropy, so passionate about her humanitarian concerns, so eager to forge a path as a now newly divorced woman that was going to be meaningful and full of significance, and yet her need for love that was unfortunately the scar of first her childhood and then her marriage kept allowing her to fall into this trap of getting involved with the wrong guy. And I would love to have said to her, please, why him? Why now? Just please, wait and make a better judgment. It's a haunting thing because it was just one act of bad judgment that would have been forgotten by the time that fall came around. And I wish for her sake that it had.
In addition to focusing on the Daily Beast right now, you're working on a new book about Bill and Hillary Clinton.
Correct.
Why the Clintons?
I think their story too has absolutely iconic, fascinations to it. That sort of two of the most famous people in the world at this point, who happen to be married to one another, and of course their personal and political dynamic is such a kind of endlessly morphing relationship that constantly expresses itself with new incident and chapters. And it's been all around me ever since I came to America, because I came in the 80s and of course lived and edited through the Clinton 90s, and have watched the post-presidency and Clinton and Hillary reinvent herself in the most extraordinary way. So I just feel this story has a fascination that people seem to feel endlessly smitten with, including myself.
What sort of accessibility will you have to the Clintons?
Well, you know, the Clintons. I know both Clintons. I've spent many an occasion in their company, and they certainly know, I think, and feel that I'm someone who has a point of view that they, I'm sure, can appreciate. But I mean, I prefer, until I finish, to not really count my chickens too much about what's happening in the course of the reporting.
Does knowing someone, of course it helps, it gives you the access, but does it make it harder in a way too?
Yes, but when the writing takes over in the end, I mean, the desire to inhabit the characters and really understand them and so forth, in the end, I think for any writer really starts to transmute the process. And I'm an enormous admirer of both of them, and that doesn't mean that, it becomes hagiography either. I mean, the desire is to paint a portrait. I mean, I think that Diana had emerged as a real character. And I think both the Clintons, have their enormous strengths, and they've made their mistakes, which they certainly admit to. And that's part of what makes them human and fascinating.
We just have under a minute left, Tina. What can we look forward to in the Daily Beast?
Well, the Daily Beast is this evolving, cultural, newsy thing, which is kind of responding to what the readers seem to want. And what is exciting about it is, I mean, every day we provide the 10 stories which we feel you have to read, which are provocative, interesting. It's like an alternative front page, if you will, plus 10 things which we assigned, which we think are provocative and interesting. And what we're finding is that the kind of the smarter the content and the more provocative the content, intellectually provocative the content, the wider the response, and the more people seem to love it. So it's a very heartening thing. I mean, it makes me feel we've connected with a smart audience who want quality in a lively package.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Congratulations
you so much.
on
Thank
all
you.
you're doing. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.